One morning, a woman in her early 30s walked into the courtroom with a calm, almost rehearsed confidence. She held a folder neatly against her side, her expression composed, her steps measured. Behind her, a middle-aged man followed, slower, his face showing a mix of confusion and frustration that hadn't settled since the case began. They took their places. The judge glanced at the file briefly, then up at both of them. There was nothing unusual on paper, but something about the woman's posture felt prepared in a way that stood out. "Ma'am, you're the plaintiff?" the judge asked. "Yes, Your Honor," she replied smoothly. "Name?" "Lena Brooks." The judge nodded and turned slightly. "And you are?" "David Carter," the man said, his voice steady but tired. The judge leaned back slightly. "All right, Ms. Brooks, go ahead." Lena stepped forward without hesitation. "Your Honor, I'm here because Mr. Carter borrowed money from me, $6,500, and has refused to pay it back." David shook his head immediately. "That's not true." The judge raised a hand. "You'll have your turn." Lena continued, unbothered. "We had an agreement. It was clear. I helped him when he needed it, and he promised to repay me within 3 months. It's been almost a year." The judge looked at her carefully. "Do you have proof of this agreement?" "Yes," she said quickly, opening her folder. "Text messages, bank transfer records, everything." She handed over the documents. The judge began flipping through them slowly. On the surface, it looked clean. A bank transfer, a message thread, numbers that lined up. Too clean. David stood still, watching. The judge finished reviewing the first few pages, then looked up. "Mr. Carter?" David stepped forward. "I didn't borrow money from her." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Then why is there a transfer of $6,500 to your account?" David didn't hesitate. "Because it wasn't a loan." Lena let out a short breath, almost amused. Of course he'd say that. The judge didn't look at her. Let him speak. David continued. "We were in a relationship. That money wasn't a loan. It was something we agreed on together." The judge's eyes narrowed slightly. "Agreed on what?" David paused, choosing his words carefully. "She offered to help me invest in a small business idea. We talked about it for weeks." Lena shook her head. "That's not what happened." The judge raised his hand again. "Ms. Brooks?" She stopped, but her expression stayed firm. David went on. "It wasn't just money handed over randomly. We had plans. She wanted to be part of it." The judge looked back at the documents. "Do the messages reflect that?" Lena stepped in quickly. "No, they reflect a loan, clearly." The judge turned a page, then another. There were messages, short ones, direct. "Send me the amount, I'll return it soon. Don't worry, I'll pay you back." The judge looked up. "These messages do suggest repayment." David frowned. "That's not the full conversation." Lena crossed her arms lightly. "It is the relevant part." The judge didn't respond to that immediately. Instead, he looked back down at the documents. Then he paused. His finger rested on one message. He read it again. Then once more. Something small but noticeable. He looked up at Lena. "Did you provide the full message thread?" "Yes," she said confidently. The judge tilted his head slightly. This appears selective. Lena's expression didn't change. It includes what matters. The judge's tone stayed calm. That's not how evidence works. David looked at the judge, then back at Lena. There's more messages, a lot more. Lena shook her head. Not relevant. The judge placed the papers down carefully. Relevance is not determined by one party. Lena didn't respond. The judge turned to David. Do you have access to the full conversation? David nodded. Yes, on my phone. The judge gestured slightly. Approach. David stepped forward, unlocking his phone with slightly unsteady hands. He scrolled, then handed it over. The judge took it and began reading. The courtroom stayed silent. Seconds passed, then a minute. The judge's expression didn't change dramatically, but something shifted, subtle, controlled. He scrolled further, then stopped, then went back up. Lena stood still, her posture still composed, but her eyes followed every movement now. The judge finally looked up. Ms. Brooks, he said. Yes? Why are there missing portions of this conversation in the documents you submitted? Lena didn't hesitate. Because they weren't relevant to the loan. The judge's eyes stayed on her. They appear to discuss an investment. Lena's jaw tightened slightly. That was just talk. David let out a breath. It wasn't just talk. The judge raised his hand again. One at a time. He looked back at Lena. These messages show you discussing profit sharing. Lena shifted slightly. Casual conversation. The judge's tone remained even. It also shows you suggesting the amount to send. She didn't answer. And it shows you saying, we'll both benefit from this, the judge added. The room grew quieter. David watched her closely now. The judge continued, that language is inconsistent with a standard loan. Lena's confidence flickered, just briefly. It doesn't change the fact that he said he would pay me back, she said. The judge nodded slowly. People say many things in conversations. Context matters. He held up the phone slightly. And the context here is incomplete in your submitted evidence. Lena's fingers tightened around her folder. David shook his head slightly. She cut out half the conversation. The judge handed the phone back, but didn't look away from Lena. Ms. Brooks, he said calmly, when you present evidence to this court, it must be complete and accurate. She nodded. It is. The judge tilted his head slightly. No, he said quietly, it isn't. That was the first crack, small but visible. Lena didn't respond immediately. The judge leaned back slightly, studying her now, not just the documents. Let me ask you directly, he said. Was this money given as a loan or as part of a shared investment discussion? Lena held her posture. It was a loan. The judge didn't react, but the way he looked at her now had changed, because something didn't line up. And for the first time since she walked in, her version of the story didn't feel as solid as it sounded. The judge kept his eyes on Lena for a moment longer, then shifted his attention back to the phone, still fresh in his mind. Mr. Carter, he said, when you received this money, what exactly did you understand it to be? David stepped forward again. It was for a business idea, a small online resale project. We talked about it for weeks before anything was sent. The judge nodded. And the messages support that? Yes, David replied. All of them, not just the ones she picked. Lena exhaled slowly, trying to steady herself. Your Honor, conversations can include a lot of ideas. That doesn't mean the final agreement wasn't a loan. The judge didn't dismiss that. That's true, but it also doesn't mean you can remove context that contradicts your claim. Lena stayed silent. The judge tapped the desk lightly. Let's be precise. He turned slightly toward David. Did you ever sign anything stating this was a loan? No. Any written agreement beyond text messages? No. The judge nodded, then looked at Lena. Did you? She hesitated. No formal contract, no. So everything relies on these messages, the judge said. Yes. The judge leaned forward slightly. Then every part of those messages matters. Lena didn't respond. The judge continued. Because right now, the full conversation shows something different from what you submitted. Lena's posture stiffened again. It still shows him agreeing to pay me back. The judge raised an eyebrow. Or it shows informal language used during a discussion about shared financial risk. David nodded slightly. Exactly. Lena shook her head. No, he said he'd return the money. The judge didn't argue that point. Instead, he shifted direction. Ms. Brooks, when did this relationship end? That question came out of nowhere, but it landed. Lena blinked once. A few months after the transfer. And how did it end? She hesitated. It wasn't relevant to this case. The judge's tone stayed calm. It might be. Lena pressed her lips together. We had disagreements. David let out a quiet breath. That's one way to put it. The judge looked at him. Go ahead. David glanced at Lena briefly, then back at the judge. The business didn't take off the way we hoped. We argued about it, about money, about expectations. The judge nodded. And then? She started saying I owed her everything back, not as an investment, as a loan. Lena immediately stepped in. Because you did. The judge raised his hand. Ms. Brooks? She stopped, but her eyes stayed fixed on David. The judge turned back to him. Did you ever agree after the fact that this was a loan? David shook his head. No. I tried to explain that we both knew it was a risk. The judge looked at Lena again. And you disagreed. Yes, she said firmly, because he promised to return it. The judge leaned back slightly, thinking. Then he spoke again. There's something I want to clarify. Both of them looked at him. When you submitted these messages, he said to Lena, did you intentionally exclude portions that discussed investment, profit sharing, and shared risk? Lena's eyes flickered again. I included what was relevant, she repeated. The judge didn't move. That's not what I asked. Silence. The room felt tighter now. I didn't think those parts mattered, she said finally. The judge nodded slowly. They matter a great deal. He paused, then added, because they change the nature of the agreement entirely. David shifted slightly, watching closely. The judge continued, if this was an investment, then the risk of loss is shared. If it was a loan, then repayment is expected regardless of outcome. Lena didn't argue that. But, the judge said, tapping the desk lightly, the full conversation suggests this was not a simple loan. Lena's composure tightened again. He still said he would pay me back. The judge looked at her carefully. People often say things during negotiations, especially when relationships are involved. That line landed quietly, but it carried weight. Lena's expression hardened slightly. So now none of his words count? The judge shook his head. They do, but they must be understood in context. He leaned forward slightly. And the context you provided was incomplete. Lena didn't respond. The judge picked up the printed messages again and held them up slightly. These excerpts create a very specific narrative. He set them back down. But the full conversation tells a different story. David nodded faintly. The judge turned his attention fully to Lena now. Ms. Brooks, I'm going to ask you something very directly. She straightened slightly. Okay. Did you present a selective version of these messages to strengthen your claim? Lena's breathing slowed, controlled but visible. I presented what supported my case. That answer hung in the air. The judge didn't react immediately, but something in the room shifted again, because that wasn't a denial. David let out a quiet breath, almost like he'd been expecting that. The judge leaned back, his eyes still on Lena. That's not how evidence works in this courtroom. Lena looked down briefly. The judge continued, when you remove context, you don't just simplify a case, you distort it. Lena's fingers tightened around the edge of her folder again. I didn't lie, she said, quieter now. The judge's response came calmly. Not directly. That made her look up. But omission can be just as misleading, he added. The room stayed still. David didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The judge tapped the papers one more time, then set them aside. Because now, he said slowly, we're no longer just looking at a financial dispute. Lena's expression shifted slightly. We're looking at how this case was presented, the judge finished, and for the first time since she walked in, the control she had carefully maintained started to slip. The shift was subtle, but it was there. Lena's shoulders weren't as steady as before. Her grip on the folder had tightened to the point where the edges bent slightly under her fingers. The judge didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Ms. Brooks, he said, calm and precise, you just told this court that you selected only the parts of the conversation that supported your claim. Lena nodded faintly. Yes. The judge held her gaze. Do you understand what that means in a legal setting? She hesitated. I thought it was enough to show the agreement. The judge shook his head slightly. It doesn't show the agreement. It shows a version of it. That distinction landed clearly. David stood quietly now, watching, no longer trying to defend himself. He didn't have to. The judge continued, "And when that version excludes key elements, like discussions of shared risk, investment, and profit, it becomes misleading." Lena looked down again. "I didn't think of it like that." The judge leaned forward just slightly. "That's the problem." There was no anger in his tone, just clarity. "You didn't think of it as misleading," he said. "You thought of it as helpful." Lena didn't respond. The judge tapped the documents lightly. "But courts don't operate on what helps one side. They operate on what's complete." The room stayed quiet. Then the judge shifted direction again. "Let's go back to the moment the money was transferred." Lena looked up. "Who initiated the idea of sending the $6,500? She hesitated. "I did." "And why?" She paused again. "Because he needed it." The judge tilted his head slightly. "For what purpose?" Lena's voice lowered. "For the business idea." That answer came out before she could stop it. David glanced at her, then back at the judge. The judge didn't react immediately. He just let the answer sit there. "For the business idea," he repeated. Lena realized it the moment he said it. She had just confirmed the very context she had been trying to minimize. "I mean," she started. The judge raised his hand gently. "No, that's clear enough." Lena stopped. The judge continued. "So you initiated the transfer, knowing it was connected to a business discussion." She didn't answer. "Correct?" he pressed. "Yes." The judge nodded once. "And at that time, was there any discussion of guaranteed repayment regardless of outcome?" Lena hesitated. David watched her closely. "Not exactly," she admitted. The judge leaned back slightly. "That matters," he said. The room stayed still, because now the structure of her claim had shifted completely. The judge continued, "In an investment, there is risk. In a loan, there is obligation. Those are two very different things." Lena's composure was fading now, not dramatically, but enough to be seen. "I still expected my money back," she said, quieter now. The judge nodded. "Expectation is not the same as agreement." David let out a slow breath. The judge turned slightly toward him. "Mr. Carter, did you ever guarantee repayment regardless of the outcome of this business idea?" David shook his head. "No, I said I'd try to make it work, that we'd both benefit if it did." The judge nodded, then looked back at Lena. "And that aligns with the full conversation." Lena didn't argue. The judge picked up her submitted documents again, holding them lightly between his fingers. "These excerpts," he said, "remove that context and create the impression of a loan." He set them down. "But the full evidence does not support that conclusion." Lena's eyes dropped to the table. The judge paused, then asked one more question. "Ms. Brooks, when you filed this case, did you believe this was truly a loan?" She hesitated longer this time. The room felt heavier. "I believed I deserved the money back," she said finally. The judge nodded slowly. That's not what I asked. Silence. Lena didn't answer. The judge leaned forward slightly, his voice still calm but sharper now. Did you believe this was a loan, or did you decide to call it one after things didn't go the way you expected? That question landed harder than anything before. Lena's lips parted slightly. No words came out. David looked at her, not with anger now, but with a kind of quiet understanding, because he already knew the answer. The judge didn't move. He didn't repeat the question. He didn't need to, because in that silence, Lena had already answered it. The silence stayed in the room longer this time. Not awkward, not uncertain, just settled. The judge leaned back slightly, his eyes still on Lena, giving her one last moment to respond. She didn't. Her posture had changed now. The confidence she walked in with was gone. In its place was something quieter, something closer to realization. The judge nodded once, as if confirming what had already become clear. "All right," he said calmly. He adjusted the papers in front of him, aligning them neatly before continuing. Based on the full evidence presented, not just the selected portions, this court finds that the $6,500 in question was not a loan. Lena closed her eyes briefly. The judge continued. It was part of a mutual understanding tied to a potential business venture, an investment discussion, and like all investments, it carried risk. David exhaled slowly, his shoulders finally relaxing. The judge's voice remained steady. There was no formal agreement establishing repayment regardless of outcome. No contract, no clear obligation. Lena didn't look up. Therefore, the judge said, the claim for repayment is denied. The words were simple, final. Lena's fingers loosened slightly from the folder. It slipped just a bit in her hands, but she caught it before it fell. David didn't move immediately. He just stood there, absorbing it. But the judge wasn't finished. And I need to address something else. Lena looked up slowly. The judge's tone shifted, not louder, but more direct. You came into this courtroom with a clear narrative, one that relied on selective evidence. Lena swallowed. You omitted key portions of communication, he continued, that significantly changed the nature of the agreement. She nodded faintly. I understand. The judge studied her for a moment. Do you? There was a pause. Yes, she said quietly. The judge continued. Because what you attempted to do wasn't just argue your side. You tried to reshape the facts. That line settled heavily. Lena didn't argue. The judge added, and that's where things cross from misunderstanding into something more serious. The room stayed still. David looked at Lena again, but there was no tension left in him, just distance. The judge leaned forward slightly. Courts depend on accuracy, not interpretation shaped to fit an outcome. Lena nodded again, slower this time. I didn't think of it like that, she said. The judge's response came calmly. Most people don't, until they're sitting where you are now.